The 2024 NFL Draft officially begins in 1 month, and all Eagles fans on day one of the draft should definitely be rooting for the Eagles to take a cornerback. All that and more coming your way on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Eagles fans? I'm Louis DiBiase, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Eagles analyst, also over at Bleacher Report on today's edition of Locked On Eagles. With the draft being 1 month away, what should we be rooting for on day one at pick 22? Or if general manager Howie Roseman decides to trade up or trade down, our least favorite ideas, our most favorite ideas for the pick, and our dark horse prospects that we'd actually be okay with on day one that maybe you wouldn't expect. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day, guys. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. I can't believe the draft is only a month away, but things are gearing up. The Eagles, of course, did work in free agency. Very happy with the moves they made on both offense and defense. Took care of some big needs. I feel pretty relaxed now at safety. I think I feel a little bit better about linebacker with Nakobe Dean and Devin White, although that move isn't enough to convince me they shouldn't take a linebacker early in this draft. I love the move at running back to get Saquon Barkley. Wide receiver 3, I think, has been upgraded. It can be better for sure, but I think Devontae Parker and Paris Campbell are some pretty solid options. Overall, really love the moves that the Eagles did make in free agency, but the draft is, as Howie Roseman mentioned, this week at the owners' meetings down in Florida. The draft is the bread and butter. That is where the long-term impact core pieces come from. And of course, we're analysts, but we're also fans. Some of us just fans. Some consider themselves only analysts. But I think the majority of people have a rooting interest, whether you are an analyst or a fan. There are certain prospects that become quote-unquote my guys that you pound the table for that you think make a lot of sense for the Eagles. Maybe it's a head pick. Maybe it's a heart pick. Maybe it's a little bit of both. But either way, you have a rooting interest. Guys you want to see in midnight green. Also, I think there are some prospects because of the position they play or the style of player they are or both that you would prefer the Eagles avoid at that 22nd overall pick or to trade up for or to trade down and attack with a lower pick in round one. And there's also some dark horse candidates that maybe people don't expect that you would be interested in. And that's the theme of the podcast. And we had some really good conversations on Twitter today with our listeners about this. So I want to share our listener answers as well. But segment 1, I want to start with my favorite ideas for day one. Segment 2, I want to go with the least favorite ideas. And then segment 3, we're going to go with the potential dark horses to target, again, at 22 overall or with a trade down in that scenario. And we're going to start with the favorites. You heard me mention it at the start of the show. I think cornerback is the move that has to be made, right? Of course, you can say they have to get a long-term tackle at some point at the right side for Lane Johnson when he eventually does retire. I think they do have to get more options long-term at linebacker. They do believe in Nakobe Dean. I think they can get back Devin White to a level of play, maybe not 2020 Super Bowl champion Devin White, but better than what he was in 2023 when he was benched and utilized that world-class speed for his position. I do think, though, linebacker is very important. I think, upgrading at tight end and wide receiver is important. Getting another safety for depth would help. But cornerback, again, you're not barren there. You have Darius Slay, who I think is still, he's not who he was as an all-pro a few years ago, but he's still a very good player. But he is over the age of 30, and his contract outside of this year, they can probably get out of that. James Bradbury's coming off one of the worst years of his career. He's over 30. He looked like he took a huge step back last year from a speed perspective, and he already wasn't that fast. He was a liability that I don't think you can trust this year. Keely Ringo definitely showed some promise. So did Eli Ricks, but are you banking on those two at such an important position? The Eagles got torn up in the secondary last year. And even if Bradbury bounces back to a certain degree this year, is he going to be a first or second team All-Pro? Even if he is, again, he's over 30. This is not a long-term option anymore. Darius Slay has been in Philadelphia. This is going to be season number what? 2020, 2021, 2, 3. Yeah, this is going to be year number 5 for Darius Slay. those aren't long-term options anymore. Keely Ringo, again, has promise, but they need to bring in a corner. They need to finally take a year and say, we need to invest a really high asset in this, whether it's through a big trade, up the board for a veteran in their prime, something. They got to do what they did with Darius Slay in 2020, but I want it to be an even younger player. I want it to be through the draft so we can have this guy for a very long time. And the favorite option I have, look, I really like Terrion Arnold. You guys have heard me talk up Nate Wiggins as well. I know the weight issues, but I'm not concerned as much with the tackling. I think you can teach that, especially with a kid that has a long, bigger frame. He can put on some weight. I like the 4.2 speed, the man coverage ability. I really like this cornerback class. I even have talked myself into Cooper DeJean a little bit and Kool-Aid McKinstry, even a Kyrie Jackson on day 2. But Quinyon Mitchell is my favorite option for the draft. Regardless of position, any outcome, to me, the number one scenario that I'd be the most happy with that Thursday for the 2024 NFL draft is if the Eagles draft Toledo cornerback Quinyon Mitchell. He's the best ball hawk of the class. I mean, he had a game where he had 4 interceptions this year. His ball instincts, his hands, his speed, he ran a 4.33 at the 40-yard dash at the combine. Just an incredible zone coverage corner with amazing vision, length. He can be physical, but also at the Senior Bowl that he proved he can play man coverage against the best of the best receivers the country has to offer. Is he as physical as Terrion Arnold? Is he as good in the run game? Not really, but he's just such a smart player too. He's not as big as some of these other corners either, but he knows how to play against every style of receiver. I thought it was so interesting to hear him talk at the Senior Bowl about how he goes about covering a shifty, smaller receiver versus a big guy, how some people think you got to press them at the line because they already struggle to create separation. If you jam them, they're not going to be able to move. But Quinyon's talking about, look, I'm a smaller cornerback. A bigger receiver is going to want to get his hands on me and move me out of the way. I like to play them in a different way and make them beat me with athleticism, which they're not going to do because this guy's wiggle, his hips, his short area burst, his footwork is unbelievable. And he's such a smart player. He went 400 coverage snaps with barely any penalties. Like, that is so hard to do at this position. Quinyon Mitchell just checks his every single box. And how perfect is it that he masks his game off of Darius Slay, who's been the best Eagles cornerback of the last decade, right? Since he's been the best corner the Eagles have had since Asante Samuel, from a year-by-year quantity perspective, quality as well, with how good he was in 2021 and 2022. Quinyon Mitchell, to me, makes the most sense. Are they going to get him at 22? No. So in this scenario, Howie Roseman would have to trade up the board. I would say into the top 15. The good news is this draft is very offense heavy. You're going to see 4 quarterbacks likely go inside the top 5. I think it's nuts, but I think J.J. McCarthy will go inside the top 5. You're going to see at least 3 receivers, Marvin Harrison Jr., Romeo Dunze, Malik Neighbors. You're going to see those guys go. You're going to see Joe Alt go at tackle. You're going to see probably at least 1 or 2 other tackles go inside the top 15. You're going to see some edge rushers like Dallas Turner go. So it's going to push some corners down the board, but there's a lot of teams in that 15 to 20 range that could use a corner. So the Eagles are going to have to move up. Luckily, they have draft picks this year and down the road. They also do have Hassan Riddick still as a trade chip, or Josh Sweat to potentially use to go up and get Quinyon Mitchell. They did it for Jalen Carter last year. They did it for Jordan Davis the year before. I think Mitchell is my favorite idea. Again, I really like Terrion Arnold. He's been the majority of draft analysts' CB1, but after the Combine and the Senior Bowl, Quinyon Mitchell it's like 1A, 1B now. I think actually more people might have Quinyon now as their top guy. I just prefer him from an athleticism standpoint, speed, ball skills, the ability to shadow a receiver. Like, his route mirroring is so impressive. He opens up his hips a little bit, sometimes too much. He's sometimes a little bit undisciplined and can oversell, but he has such great makeup speed and athleticism that, again, you can teach that kind of stuff. I think Quinyon makes so much sense. He has ties with Nick Sirianni and his coaching staff. Quinyon Mitchell is my favorite idea for the Eagles. In any scenario, moving up for the Toledo corner would be my number one preference. As excited as I would be about other options, Quinyon is CB1 in my book. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, what do I not want to happen for the draft on day 1 for the Eagles? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. College basketball and me, we struggle with FanDuel, so I normally like to go with the one seed, but there's been some huge upsets. There are every single year. You can bet on those at FanDuel. Right now, new customers, you get $200 back in bonus bets with your first $5 bet if it wins. That's $200 back to use on point spreads, money line bets. You can even pick who's going to win it all and cut those nets down. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. You got the draft coming up too. There's a lot of stuff to bet on. Baseball season's coming up. I'm not a baseball guy, but there's a lot of Phillies fans that listen to this show. You can bet on it all at FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network, and of course, Locked On Eagles. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, want to let you know that Locked On, we've launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you got to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. Again, it's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Yeah, I love this conversation we had on Twitter today. It's a rooting interest a month away from the draft. I asked 3 questions on our Locked On Birds Twitter account. The top prospect you want the Eagles to draft in the first round. You guys know for me, it's Quinyon Mitchell. Number 2, and we're going to get into this now, the prospect you'd be the least happy with on day 1. And 3, your dark horse prospect that you'd be okay with at 22. To go over some of the favorites that our listeners put here on Twitter, we got one, Quinyon Mitchell. We've got another Quinyon Mitchell. We've got Edgerrin Cooper, the linebacker from Texas A&M, who we took on Mock Draft Monday. We traded down from 22 to 32 to select. Love that idea, honestly, on day 1. I think he'd be the perfect right-hand man for Nakobe Dean. Very similar to Devin White as well. We've got a Nate Wiggins. We've got a Terrion Arnold. The theme definitely was corner. I think our listeners do agree that that has to be the focus on day 1. Does that mean it's going to be? I'll believe it when I see it. I think if gun to my head right now, a month away from the draft, they're going to trade up for a tackle. Like that's what I think they're going to do because that's what this football team does. But Howie Roseman does believe in cornerback play. Like that's not a position that he sees the same way as even safety or linebacker or running back. He's invested in corner. He just really doesn't do it early in the draft. This is the year, I think, to do it. Go up and get Quinyon Mitchell. That's my favorite idea and a lot of yours as well. My least favorite options on day 1, I actually had one player. I tweeted it out, and then I deleted the tweet with this exercise because I thought of somebody else. Originally, I had Liatu Latu, the edge rusher from UCLA. Just because, again, I feel like he's a floor player. I think he's going to come in right away and be an impact starter for an NFL team, but I don't love his traits compared to, Jared Verse from Florida State or a Dallas Turner from Alabama. Don't think the ceiling is as high. He has some injury history as well that I'm concerned about. Also, the Eagles just really don't need to go edge. Like they have an abundance of edge rushers right now. They need to actually unload one of them probably, and it'll likely be Hassan Riddick. But they've got Riddick right now under contract, Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, Nolan Smith, of course, and Brandon Graham. Like those are 5 guys, and Patrick Johnson, 6 players that have a lot of experience. So the position doesn't make sense for me. I don't love the floor play. It's kind of a safe, boring pick. I wouldn't be a big fan of that also from an injury perspective. Although he's a good player, he killed it at the Senior Bowl. I think he'll be a good player at the NFL, just not my preference. So that was the original guy that I put down, but then I changed it to Oregon center Jackson Powers Johnson. I just feel like it'd be very redundant at this point and just not very productive to draft yet another replacement for Jason Kelce. Originally, when Landon Dickerson was picked in 2021, it was not to be the long-term left guard. It was to be the center, and then Jason Kelce played another 3 years, and Landon Dickerson became one of the best left guards in football, so you kept him there, which made you feel comfortable enough in the second round of the 2022 NFL draft to draft Cam Jurgens, who Jason Kelce says was kind of a mini-me. Like, it was a player that he advocated for the Eagles drafting. And then he played right guard last year because Jason Kelce still wouldn't retire and played pretty well. If they say we're going to keep those guys at guard and now take another center, I don't know. I think drafting that many interior offensive linemen with top picks, not to say it's not an important position, it is, especially in the modern day NFL with how good defensive tackles are becoming at getting to the quarterback, like Jalen Carter, like Fletcher Cox and Aaron Donald, who both just retired. Like, it's a very important position, but to use 3 top assets in that when I think Cam Jurgens should fit center very well, considering that's his natural position from Nebraska. Also, you took Tyler Steen right at the top of the 3rd round last year to be eventually a long-term starter, whether it's at tackle or I think he can be a good right guard this year. Nick Sirianni kind of was a little tight-lipped about Steen's role this year, but talked about his versatility. You have him, who Lane Johnson has compared to Brandon Brooks in the past. I think they have the pieces in place where I like Jackson Powers Johnson, so does Geno, obviously, Oregon Ducks. I think he's a really good prospect that has killed it this offseason at the Senior Bowl and at the Combine. But I don't know. I think that's just a bad call. And then Tyler Steen, he's a long-term backup or that you took at the top of the 3rd round? He was essentially a 2nd-round pick, but you moved down. They were going to take him with that 2nd-rounder. And then really that's it. I don't know. I mean, maybe he's your long-term right tackle replacement for Lane Johnson, but I just that pick would be my least favorite, even over Latu. I don't know. For me, that's just an idea I don't want to explore. I don't even really love the idea of taking a tackle in the 1st round, but I'd rather take a player that's tackle guard versatile than guard center. To me, it's if you're going to take an offensive lineman, it's got to be a tackle. But either way, I just don't love those ideas. Let me see what you guys said for your least favorite. I'm very curious about this one. And I think you're probably with me that it's off. I think we have trench fatigue in Philadelphia. Not that all of us think that they shouldn't be going with the trenches the majority of the time, but we've recognized this is the time to pause that. Not even pause it. You can take tackles on day 2, or even if I'm not saying don't take a tackle or an offensive or defensive lineman in the 1st round, but in the first 2 rounds, you have to give us at least 1 corner and or linebacker. Like, you just have to. You got to take a year where you do this. And I think we are all in agreement. There's somebody here that tweets in their least favorite idea is any offensive tackle. We have another Jackson Powers Johnson. We have a Chopper Robinson, the edge rusher from Penn State, who, again, I really like, super explosive, a very high-ceiling player. We are. Go Nittany Lions, of course, for a lot of our Penn State fans listening. Chop is a player that I would like if you didn't have 5 edge rushers, but I'm with Griff, who's one of our good listeners. He wrote that and completely agree with that for sure. So I think it's lineman. That's my least favorite idea. Even if they went, honestly, I would like the receiver or tight end option better than line. And I think some people might disagree with that, but I think it's time to not take a break from it, but prioritize some other positions here and get just one gem prospect, like top tier prospect, specifically at corner, but it can be linebacker. It could be still safety. I don't think there's a guy in this class for that. If you think there's an upgrade over Reed Blankenship or Sidney Brown, but to me, it's corner or linebacker, and I think we got to pause on the trench play for sure. If it's a tackle, again, that's not my least favorite idea. Mine was a center. My least favorite idea is an interior offensive lineman. All right, or edge. All right, guys, coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles, dark horse prospects that we kind of like at 22 that we'd be like, all right, I'm digging that. I like it, Howie. We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, guys, today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by Game Time. You shouldn't have to worry when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. See the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. All-in prices show your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. Buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. They're obsessed with finding ways to help you save money on tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. For me, it's probably going to be comedy. I've been so into the stand-up scene right now. Been going to so many comedy shows thanks to Game Time. Terms do apply. Again, create that account, redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, Eagles fans, we're going through rooting interest for the 2024 NFL Draft on day one. My favorite idea is drafting Toledo corner Quinyon Mitchell, not just drafting him, but trading up to go get him, because they're not going to get Quinyon at pick 22. Whether they trade up for Terrion Arnold or Nate Wiggins, drafting a corner should be their number one priority. Quinyon Mitchell is my CB1, and I think to start the offseason, he was probably CB2 or CB3 for most draft analysts, and I think for a lot now, people would agree he's that top guy over Arnold, Wiggins, DeJean, Kool-Aid McKinstry, whoever you prefer. I think right now a lot of people, the majority, prefer Quinyon Mitchell. My least favorite idea, at first, it was UCLA edge rusher Laitu Latu. Not hating that as much as this idea I thought of, drafting yet another center to replace Jason Kelce, Oregon center Jackson Powers Johnson. Don't hate either prospect, hate the position, hate the style, the floor versus ceiling debate. Just not a great idea on either front for me, but Jackson Powers Johnson is my least favorite idea on day one. And then dark horses, like who's a player that, betting wise, you're not going to say is a favorite to be an Eagle, but you'd be like, okay, I'm actually in on that. Maybe it's a surprise because of his position, or you just don't think he'd be on the Eagles' radar, or maybe you don't think, some people say he's a day one prospect. For me, the dark horse would be Xavier Worthy. And you've heard me talk about him a little bit on this show, but I am so, again, is Xavier Worthy going to be the best receiver on the board at 22? Probably not. Is he a long-term top 2 receiver in this league? Probably not. So, like, if you're the Buffalo Bills or a team that really needs a wide receiver like the Arizona Cardinals, am I drafting Xavier Worthy? Probably not. But for the Philadelphia Eagles, who have 2 elite alphas established at receiver that can do it all, in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, an elite tight end in Dallas Goedert, an elite running back that can do it all in Saquon Barkley, why not get the fastest receiver maybe ever, who broke the 40-yard dash record at the Combine, to be in the slot, to just be what Quez Watkins couldn't, and run a few routes, crossers, screens, use them in pre-snap motion, get the ball in his hands in space, deep down the field, vertical routes, and have him be that field stretcher. Imagine a defense saying, the 5th guy we have to prepare for is Xavier Worthy. And again, it's more of a luxury pick. It's probably not a very smart use of resources when you have 2 receivers you're going to have to pay $20+ million. And Xavier Worthy likely wouldn't get a second contract here. So in that way, it's the same logic for why I always said don't draft running backs early if you're not going to pay them. I want a first or second round player to get at least 2 contracts for the Eagles. But I think this is more of a heart pick of just saying, wow, what an insane 5 years that could be, though, with Xavier Worthy, especially considering Dallas Goedert is getting up there in age and has an injury history, and this team is 11 personnel heavy with Nick Sirianni. He would have a big role. He'd be on the field the majority of the time. Like, he's small. He does have some, potential durability concerns, but man, what an unstoppable offense this would be with A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, and then Xavier Worthy thrown into the mix. I also thought of another guy for a dark horse. Worthy is my number 1 option, but what about Brock Bowers? What if the top tight end from Georgia falls from, what was expected as a top 10, 15 pick? What if he falls in that 17 to 20 range? Would the Eagles say, screw it, let's trade up for the best tight end in this class, the best tight end prospect probably since Kyle Pitts, if not better? Say this year we've got Dallas Goedert and Brock Bowers in a 12 personnel package with Smith and Brown on the field at the same time and Saquon Barkley. And then Bowers is our new Dallas Goedert. He replaces him like Goddard did Zach Ertz. Goddard is the same age that Ertz was when they drafted Goddard back in 2018. And as I mentioned on the show the other day, I don't think Goddard will last as long as Zach Ertz because of his durability issues and his more physical style of play. He takes a lot more hits. He's a run after the catch guy. I think Brock Bowers is another name that if he fell, because that is a guy that probably would have multiple contracts in Philadelphia. So maybe that's a better idea than Xavier Worthy. I love the idea of Worthy. You guys know I really want a field stretcher to be that 3rd guy for Smith and Brown. It's why I really liked the potential of Quez Watkins. It's like the Paris Campbell signing. That's a 4.31 speed guy. It's why I really liked that move as well. Let's see some dark horse picks here from our listeners. We got a Nate Wiggins. We've got an Xavier Worthy. We've got a Jackson Powers Johnson. Well, somebody likes the idea of taking a center. We've got another receiver here, Brian Thomas from LSU. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I like that a lot. And then we've got actually Chop Robinson, somebody to throw in Chop Robinson and Jared Verse. Yeah, okay, interesting. I think that's the dark horse again would be like a position you're not expecting as much. Maybe it's more of a luxury pick, and I would say that's wide receiver and tight end. Tight end isn't as much of a luxury pick as receiver is because you probably want a long-term replacement for Goddard and a pass-friendly 12 personnel package. But I'd still say compared to like corner, linebacker, tackle, even maybe like edge or safety at this point, tight end's probably a luxury pick. But I think these are heart picks. I think the fan in us would be really excited about that, but if we were the GMs and we had to use our head, we probably wouldn't make those selections. But you never know with Howie Roseman. His strategy changes, it feels like, every year, outside of the fact that he's always going to go trenches, at least with one pick early on. All right, keep letting me know what your rooting interest is, guys, on Twitter, at LockedOnBirds, at DiBiase LOE. Really want to hear from you. What's your favorite idea for the Eagles in the draft on day one, your least favorite idea, and the dark horse prospect you'd be okay with at 22, or if they move up the board or down. That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Eagles. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow and Friday for 2 more shows this week. We thank you so much for making us your first listen each and every day. I'm Louis DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.